The Bay of Biscay at night is a graveyard without grave markers. In July 1942, the waters off the coast of France lie silent and empty under a full moon, indifferent to the violence that's about to unfold. Squadron leader Jefferson Herbert Greswell grips the control column of his Wellington bomber with both hands, his eyes straining against the darkness beyond the windscreen. He's flown this route 17 times. 17 times the radar has picked up a contact. A German U-boat running on the surface, recharging its batteries in the hours when it believes the darkness is its shield. 17 times, Greswell has descended through the night toward that radar blip, hoping this time would be different. 17 times, he's watched the target vanish beneath the waves in the seconds before his bombardier could release a single depth charge. The mathematics of it are brutal. Radar gives you distance and bearing, nothing more. When your aircraft is 5 miles away from a target, the U-boat is invisible. At 3 miles, still invisible. At 1 mile, still darkness. Only when you get close enough to see it visually, really see it, with your own eyes through the windscreen, do you have a chance at an attack. And in those final moments, the submarine crew hears the Wellington's engines. 4 Rolls-Royce Merlins, each producing 1,050 horsepower, making a sound no man can mistake. That sound means death is coming. The alarm goes up. The klaxons sound below deck. Men scramble for the conning tower hatch. The diving planes tilt, and the boat begins its descent into sanctuary. The window for attack lasts 23 seconds. That's the gap between visual acquisition and complete submergence. A U-boat can dive in less than a minute under ideal conditions. Most nights, it's faster than that. Men who have spent months working with radar operators, who have trained for precision attacks, who have flown in perfect formation and descended with exact control. These men arrive at an empty patch of water and watch their depth charges sink into nothingness. No explosions, no debris, no oil slicks. Nothing but the sound of their engines fading into the night as they turn away from another failed attack. Back at RAF Chivener in Devon, the pilots of Coastal Command's 172 Squadron are accustomed to this failure. They arrive at debriefing with their depth charges still in their bomb bays, their bombardiers frustrated, their radar operators angry. The senior officers take notes, file reports, and send them up the chain. Probable damage. Possible kill, oil slick observed. No one believes the oil slick story, no one believes any of it. The submarines are winning because darkness is their weapon and Britain hasn't found a way to take the night away from them. The statistics are grinding the country toward defeat. In 1941, Coastal Command manages to sink exactly 1 German submarine in the entire Bay of Biscay. 1. In that same period, German U-boats are slaughtering merchant shipping at a rate of 400,000 tons per month. Food shipments from America aren't reaching Britain. Ammunition shipments are being diverted. The blockade is working. Germany has throttled the British economy, and it's only getting worse. Naval analysts are calculating how long Britain can survive on current supplies. 12 weeks. That's the number being whispered in offices where the future is being measured. 12 weeks before rationing becomes so severe that the country falls apart. The U-boats don't need to invade. They just need to starve the island. Coastal Command is being asked to fix this with inadequate tools. The ASV Mark II radar is revolutionary, no question about it. A few years ago, the idea of detecting a submarine from 10 miles away would have seemed impossible. Now it's routine. But routine detection isn't victory. Victory requires sinking submarines. And sinking submarines, it turns out, requires seeing them at the moment you're already on top of them in the darkness after they've heard your engines coming. The RAF has tried everything. Flares, they work, but they burn for 30 seconds, long enough to warn the submarine that danger is coming. Searchlights, they require too much power from the aircraft's electrical system, and the weight makes the aircraft unstable. Faster attacks, physics doesn't negotiate. Acoustic torpedoes, they miss by hundreds of yards without a visual reference point. Trained crews attacking with precision, still arriving at empty water. Month after month, the same pattern repeats. Radar contact, approach, submergence, failure. By spring of 1942, the experts have reached a consensus. The head of Coastal Command's development unit, the RAF's Elite Innovation Squadron, publishes a formal conclusion. Successful night attacks on surface submarines are technically unfeasible given current limitations. The problem, according to men with advanced degrees in physics and engineering, has no solution within the existing laws of electrical engineering and aircraft design. The night belongs to the U-boats. Accept it, plan accordingly. Then Humphrey Diver Lee walks into RAF Chivener carrying a blueprint in his head and a willingness to be court-martialed. Lee is 44 years old, which in 1942 might as well be ancient in military aviation. Most combat pilots are half his age, men with reflexes still measured in milliseconds, men who have grown up flying fighters and bombers. Lee learned to fly in the Royal Flying Corps during World War I, when aircraft were made of canvas and wood, when engines were temperamental, when the concept of sustained aerial combat was still being invented in real time. He soloed in a Farman biplane. He flew reconnaissance missions over the Western Front. He watched men die in ways that 20th century technology made possible. Then the war ended and Lee went back to civilian life. He disappeared. Most of his fellow pilots from the Great War assumed he was done. The war was over, they had survived, and the business of flying was now the business of airlines and wealthy businessmen. Lee had no interest in either. He spent the 1920s and 1930s in quiet obscurity. He wasn't famous, wasn't celebrated, wasn't looking for the next war. Then September 1939 arrived, and Lee made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone who knew him. At 42 years old, with 20 years of civilian life behind him, with no combat decorations and no particular distinction in the RAF, Humphrey Lee walked back into an RAF recruitment office and asked for his old job back. He wanted to fly maritime patrols. He wanted to hunt submarines. The RAF accepted him immediately. They were desperate for experienced pilots, any experienced pilots, and Lee's age actually worked in his favor. He wasn't raw material that needed combat training. He could fly, he knew how to handle an aircraft in bad weather. He'd flown in darkness over hostile territory. The RAF posted him to Coastal Command, which everyone understood to be the backwater assignment. The glamorous pilots were in Fighter Command, becoming legends in the skies over London. The successful pilots were in Bomber Command, hitting targets in Germany, earning promotion and awards. Coastal Command was endless patrols over empty ocean, searching for submarines, almost never finding them, and on the rare occasions when they did find them, almost never sinking them. It was the assignment nobody wanted, but Lee volunteered for it anyway. During his first year back in active service, Lee flew more than 300 hours of anti-submarine patrols. 300 hours of sitting in a cockpit, watching radar screens, descending toward contacts that vanished, returning to base with empty bomb bays. But Lee wasn't thinking about glory. He wasn't keeping count of how many decorations he'd earned or how fast he might make wing commander. He was thinking about mathematics. Between patrols, Lee filled notebook after notebook with calculations. Radar detection ranges, aircraft approach speeds, submarine dive times, visual acquisition distances, the geometry of intercept, the physics of underwater pressure, the electrical requirements of various lighting systems. He sketched designs for hypothetical equipment that didn't exist. He worked through problems that hadn't been formally identified as problems by anyone else in the squadron. His fellow pilots thought he was obsessive. His squadron commander thought he was wasting valuable time that should be spent in the officers' mess, building morale and social connections. But Lee was building something else. He was building the framework for a solution to a problem that everyone else had declared unsolvable. In December 1941, on a routine night patrol over the Bay of Biscay, Lee was flying at 2,000 feet when his radar operator picked up a contact. The submarine was running on the surface, confident in its invisibility. Lee began his approach exactly as he'd done dozens of times before. Slow descent, engines throttled back, perfect course correction. Then something unusual happened. Half a mile from the target, Lee's co-pilot spotted a fishing boat running its lights. For exactly 3 seconds, those lights illuminated the water below. In those 3 seconds, Lee saw it, the conning tower of a U-boat, black against moonlit water, perfectly visible. Then the fishing boat turned, the lights swept away, darkness returned. By the time Lee reached the attack position, the submarine had dived. He returned to base with empty weapons and a mind that had been fundamentally changed by 3 seconds of light. The breakthrough that would change naval warfare didn't come from an engineering laboratory or a government think tank. It came from a napkin on the desk of a middle-aged pilot with no formal training in physics or electrical engineering. The night after his encounter with the fishing boat's lights, Humphrey Lee sat in the officers' quarters at RAF Chivener and sketched his first design. A carbon arc searchlight, 24 inches in diameter, mounted in a retractable housing beneath the aircraft. The pilot keeps it off during the entire radar approach, maintaining complete silence and darkness. Then, at exactly 20 feet altitude and 50 yards from the target, he flips a switch. 22 million candle power of pure white light erupts from beneath the aircraft, turning night into day. The submarine crew is frozen. The bombardier has exactly 3 seconds to release his depth charges. 3 seconds is all that's needed. The idea is simple, almost elegant in its simplicity. Turn the night into day for 3 seconds. That's enough time to locate the target, aim, and attack. That's enough time to win the battle that's being lost in darkness. Lee had seen it work, not with his invention but with the fishing boat's lights. He knew it was possible. Now he needed to build it. The next morning, Lee requested a meeting with his commanding officer and explained the design. The response was immediate and devastating. The commanding officer listened to Lee's explanation, then delivered the verdict. That is completely illegal under current electrical specifications, also physically impossible, request denied. But Lee didn't salute and return to his duties. Instead, he did something that would have gotten most officers reassigned or dishonorably discharged. He acknowledged the order and then he ignored it completely. He didn't apply for additional authorization. He didn't request a budget. He didn't assemble a team of engineers. He just walked to the development unit's workshop and started building. The mechanics at Chivener had seen enough failed ideas die in committees. They'd watched good concepts get buried under bureaucracy, watched necessary innovations get delayed by regulations written for different wars. They didn't officially authorize what Lee was doing. They just happened to be in the workshop when he started working on his projects. They happened to have parts lying around. They happened to assist in ways that could be interpreted, if necessary, as routine maintenance and equipment testing. Lee started with car headlamps, salvaged from vehicles that no longer had other use. He modified them, rewired them, mounted them on a wooden frame. The result was brighter than nothing, but nowhere near bright enough. He needed to illuminate a target from 200 feet in total darkness. Car headlamps weren't going to do it. He moved to aircraft landing lights, heavier construction, more powerful bulbs, better but still inadequate. The math was simple and unforgiving. To illuminate a submarine from 200 feet, you needed a specific amount of luminous flux. The landing lights didn't produce enough. He needed something more powerful. In March 1942, Lee found what he was looking for, a naval carbon arc searchlight designed for battleships. This wasn't some improvised piece of equipment. This was a weapon-grade optical system capable of producing 22 million candle power. It had been designed by naval engineers to illuminate targets at sea during combat. It was exactly what Lee needed. It was also, according to every Air Ministry electrical engineer who looked at it, completely impossible to install on a Wellington bomber. The problem was power. The searchlight drew enough current to blow every circuit breaker on the aircraft. The Wellington's electrical generator simply couldn't produce that much power. Every expert who examined the problem reached the same conclusion: it can't be done. Lee didn't disagree with the analysis. The electrical generator really couldn't power the light. So he didn't use the generator. Instead, he designed a massive battery pack technically illegal under Air Ministry specifications, which strictly regulated modifications to aircraft electrical systems. This battery pack could deliver the current needed to power the searchlight for exactly the duration Lee had calculated. 3 seconds of full illumination, long enough to spot the target and attack, short enough that the batteries wouldn't overheat or the weight become impossible to manage. The entire assembly, the searchlight, the battery pack, the retractable housing, the wiring, the mounting brackets, weighed 800 pounds. This was significant. A Wellington bomber had a maximum bomb load capacity. Adding 800 pounds of equipment meant removing 4 depth charges from the normal load. Lee's illegal invention would reduce the aircraft's weapon capacity by approximately 30%. His commanding officer discovered the project in May 1942. The confrontation was brief and brutally direct. The officer arrived at the workshop and saw the retractable housing, the massive battery pack, the carbon arc light mounted beneath the fuselage. He called Lee into his office. "You violated 3 separate Air Ministry directives," the commanding officer said. "You've wasted ground resources. You've installed unauthorized equipment on operational aircraft. I should court-martial you." Lee stood at attention, maintaining perfect military bearing. His voice was calm and level. "With respect, sir, I request permission to conduct one operational test. If it doesn't work, I'll personally dismantle every component at my own expense and accept any punishment you deem appropriate." The commanding officer stared at him for a full 10 seconds, long enough for the implications to settle, long enough for every regulation to be weighed against the possibility of change. Finally, he spoke. "One test, you fail, you're done, clear." "Yes, sir." On the night of June 3, 1942, Lee took off from RAF Chivener in Wellington Ease 986. His crew thought this would be his last flight before reassignment to a desk job if he wasn't court-martialed first. His co-pilot was an Australian named Alan Triggs, who had volunteered specifically to witness what he called Lee's suicide mission. The flight plan was simple: patrol the Bay of Bisque until the radar operator picked up a submarine contact, then use the illegal searchlight for one attack run. Either the light worked or Lee's career ended tonight. There was no middle ground. At 2:17 in the morning, the radar operator picked up a contact 12 miles ahead. Lee throttled back the engines, began his descent, and approached in total darkness. The submarine was running on the surface, making 17 knots, its crew confident that darkness provided absolute safety. Lee descended to 50 feet, lined up on the radar bearing, and called out range checks to his bombardier. "Hold steady," Lee said. The aircraft was now at attack altitude, racing toward the target in complete darkness. 200 yards, 100 yards, 50 yards. Lee reached for the switch. The night exploded into day. 22 million candle power of pure white light erupted from beneath the Wellington bomber. The darkness dissolved completely. Where there had been nothing a moment before, there was now perfect clarity. Every detail of the Italian submarine Luigi Torelli was visible. The deck crew scrambling in panic, officers diving for the conning tower hatch, the wake spreading white behind the boat as it tried desperately to dive. But 3 seconds wasn't enough time for submergence. The crew was frozen in the light, unable to move, unable to react with the speed necessary to escape what was coming. Lee's bombardier needed no instruction. The depth charges dropped in a perfect stick, bracketing the submarine's pressure hull. The light switched off exactly 3 seconds after activation. Lee banked hard right, climbing and turning for home. Behind him, the depth charges detonated. The explosions picked the submarine up and shattered its hull. Luigi Torelli broke in half and sank in under 2 minutes. The crew never had time to send a distress signal. The crew never had time to do anything but die in darkness, moments after being exposed to brilliant light. When Lee landed at Chivener 6 hours later, he walked into the debriefing office and filed a report that would change everything. Submarine illuminated at 37 hours, attacked with depth charges, target destroyed, request permission for additional patrols. The words were matter of fact, neither understated nor exaggerated. The device works. That's what the report meant. The illegal equipment, the unauthorized modification, the regulation violations, all of it had worked exactly as Lee had designed it to work. 2 days later, Lee stood before a review board at Coastal Command headquarters. Present were his station commander, 2 Air Ministry engineers, a representative from the Admiralty, and Air Chief Marshal Philip Jalbert de la Ferté, the newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of Coastal Command. The mood in the room was openly hostile. Everyone there except Jalbert believed that Lee should be punished for his unauthorized actions, regardless of whether the test had succeeded. The senior Air Ministry engineer opened the attack immediately. "Squadron Leader Lee, your unauthorized modification violates Section 7, Paragraph 4 of Air Ministry Order 19,416, which expressly forbids installation of non-standard electrical equipment exceeding generator capacity. You've bypassed safety systems, installed unapproved batteries, and created a significant fire hazard. This device should be immediately removed from service." Lee remained standing, his voice was steady. "With respect, sir, the device successfully illuminated a submarine target and enabled an attack that resulted in the destruction of an enemy vessel." The Admiralty representative cut in immediately. "Destroyed based on a single test with training depth charges. In an operational configuration with full weapon load, the results might be different. You've created an 800-pound weight penalty that reduces our bomb load to achieve something our destroyers could have accomplished anyway." "If I had attacked with operational depth charges instead of training charges," Lee responded, "the target would have been destroyed with certainty. I used training charges specifically to minimize risk to personnel during the first test." The room erupted. 3 officers began speaking simultaneously. The station commander demanded documentation. The engineers insisted on 3 months of safety testing. The Admiralty representative questioned the entire premise of night attacks on submarines. These were reasonable objections. They were also objections that applied to every innovation, every risk, every deviation from established procedure. Lee stood at attention, saying nothing while his career burned around him. Then Air Chief Marshal Jalbert raised one hand. The room fell silent immediately. Jalbert had been Commander-in-Chief of Coastal Command for exactly 8 days. He'd taken command on June 5th, 2 days before Lee's unauthorized mission. He was a pragmatist who'd spent the last week reviewing statistics that made him physically ill. 1 submarine sunk in the Bay of Biscay in all of 1941. Meanwhile, U-boats were sinking 60 Allied ships per month. The numbers weren't abstractions. They represented men drowning in oil-slicked water, ships breaking in half, supplies disappearing into the Atlantic, Britain's lifeline to America being slowly strangled. Jalbert knew exactly what the situation meant. He knew that conventional approaches weren't working. He knew that something had to change. "Wing Commander Lee," Jalbert said, the promotion implicit in the form of address. "How many submarines could you sink per month if I gave you 10 aircraft equipped with this device?" Lee didn't hesitate. 5, sir, minimum. One of the engineers nearly choked. "That's absurd. You've conducted exactly 1 test. You have no statistical foundation for that claim." Jalbert ignored him completely, his eyes still on Lee. "I'd settle for 6 submarines if you could manage 1 per week. That would be more than we've managed in months." He turned to address his staff directly. "Gentlemen, I've reviewed Squadron Leader Lee's service record. 1,500 hours of maritime patrol, 2 years in the development unit. 0 disciplinary incidents until this one. He broke regulations because regulations were stopping him from winning the war. Now you can spend 3 months testing his device while we sink another 200 merchant ships. Or you can install his searchlight on every available Wellington in 172 Squadron and see what happens." "I choose option 2. The room erupted again, but this time Jalbert let it run for only 30 seconds before standing to his feet. Everyone went silent. "Squadron Leader Lee, you're hereby promoted to Wing Commander and assigned to command 172 Squadron. You will equip your squadron with your searchlight device and conduct operational patrols beginning no later than July 1st. You will train your pilots personally. You will submit weekly kill reports directly to my office. You will prove your device works, or you will accept full responsibility for wasting resources during wartime. Clear?" "Yes, sir. Dismissed." As Lee left the room, the Admiralty representative made one final protest. "Sir, with respect, we're basing operational doctrine on one partially successful test of unauthorized equipment, designed by an officer with no engineering qualifications." Jalbert cut him off with a single sentence that would be remembered for decades. "Do you know what our current success rate is for night attacks on submarines? 0.3%. That's not a doctrine, that's statistical noise. Wing Commander Lee just gave us our first confirmed night attack in 2 years. I'll take amateur hour over expert failure any day of the week. Expert failure any day of the week." By July 1, 1942, 172 Squadron had received 12 Wellington bombers equipped with the Lee light. The pilots didn't believe it would work. They'd spent months watching conventional radar approaches fail. They'd experienced the frustration of arriving at targets that vanished. They'd felt the weight of regulations, the limitations of existing equipment, the mathematics of failure. Now they were being asked to trust an invention designed by their commanding officer, an invention that had worked exactly once in darkness against a single target. One successful test. That was the entire basis for this new doctrine. Flight Lieutenant Norman Merrington voiced what everyone was thinking during the operational briefing. "So we're supposed to fly at 50 feet in darkness over open ocean and turn on a spotlight that weighs 800 pounds and might blind us if we look at it wrong. And this is somehow safer than dropping flares." Lee stood at the front of the briefing room, utterly calm, the absolute confidence of a man who had already solved the equation. "The Lee light activates for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, you will have perfect visual on a surface submarine at attack distance. Your bombardier will have a clear target. The U-boat crew will be frozen in shock, unable to man deck guns or reach the hatch. You will drop your depth charges and be gone before they recover. That's the theory. The test proved it works. Now we verify the method." The pilots still looked doubtful, but orders were orders, and Jalbert had been explicit about timelines. They would patrol. They would test the device in combat. They would prove whether this worked or admit that Lee's invention was a waste of valuable equipment and resources. The first combat success came faster than anyone expected. On July 5, 1942, exactly 1 month after Lee's initial test, Pilot Officer Wiley B. Howell took off from RAF Chivener on a routine night patrol in a Lee light-equipped Wellington. Howell was an American volunteer, 22 years old, flying his 8th mission with 172 Squadron. He'd never used the Lee light in combat. His crew was skeptical. His bombardier was skeptical. Everyone was skeptical. But Howell had spent enough time watching experienced pilots work to have absorbed some of their professionalism. He knew the procedures. He knew what Lee had taught him. He knew what could happen if he executed the attack correctly. At 11:34 p.m., his radar operator picked up a contact. It was U-502, a Type VIIC submarine commanded by Captain Lieutenant Eugen von Rosenstiel. The boat was returning from a successful patrol in the Caribbean, filled with confidence from weeks of hunting merchant shipping without interference. It was running on the surface, making 17 knots, completely unaware that a transformation in naval warfare had just begun. Howell began his approach exactly as Lee had taught him: throttle back, slow descent, maintain absolute radio silence. At 3 miles from the contact, he could see nothing, just darkness and moonlight reflecting on waves. At 1 mile, still nothing. At 200 yards, his navigator called out through the intercom, "Target should be dead ahead." Howell saw only water. At 50 yards, he flipped the switch. The Lee light transformed night into noon. There, frozen in perfect illumination, was U-502. The deck crew was scrambling. Officers were diving for the hatch. The wake was spreading white behind the boat as the commander tried desperately to initiate an emergency dive. But physics doesn't negotiate with desperation. The diving planes tilted, the ballast vents opened, the boat began its descent into water. Howell's bombardier didn't need instructions. 6 depth charges dropped in a perfect stick, bracketing the submarine's pressure hull. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, the light switched off. Howell banked hard right, climbing, already turning for home. Behind him, U-502 experienced the last seconds of its existence. The depth charges detonated. The explosions were close enough to rupture the pressure hull. The submarine didn't sink slowly. It didn't flood gradually. It broke in half in the violent cascade of water and high explosive. U-502 went down in under 2 minutes. All 52 crew members died. None survived long enough to send a distress signal. The next morning, Howell landed at Chivener and filed a report that changed history. Submarine illuminated at 37 hours, attacked with depth charges, target destroyed, requests permission for additional patrols. Lee read the report 3 times. Then he walked directly to Jalbert's office and placed it on his desk without comment. Jalbert read it once. Then he picked up his phone and called the Air Ministry. "This is Air Chief Marshal Jalbert. I want Lee lights installed on every Wellington in Coastal Command. Not next month, now." The kills accelerated. July 7th, Squadron Leader Jefferson Gresswell, Lee's own co-pilot from the first test, illuminated and attacked U-159. The submarine was damaged beyond immediate repair, limped to port with a shattered hull and never returned to sea. July 13th, U-751 was caught recharging on the surface, sunk in one attack with all hands. July 16th, U-335 was destroyed in the Bay of Bisque. No survivors. The pattern was clear. The Lee light worked. The attacks that had failed 1,000 times before were suddenly succeeding. By August, RAF Coastal Command was sinking more submarines in the Bay of Bisque than in the previous 12 months combined. The numbers were staggering. The success rate jumped from 0.3% to 40%. A 100-fold increase from one modification designed by one officer with no engineering degree. The German response came quickly. U-boat commanders realized immediately that the night surface recharge operation had become lethal. Admiral Karl Dönitz issued emergency orders. All boats would recharge batteries during daylight hours only. Night surface operations were suspended until further notice. But daylight operations meant RAF fighters were in the sky. Daylight operations meant radar-equipped ships were nearby. Daylight operations meant convoys had air cover. The U-boats were trapped. Surface at night and face the Lee light. Surface by day and face everything else. The choice wasn't whether to risk death, it was choosing which kind of death to risk. The statistics told the story of a war being transformed. In the 5 months before the Lee light became operational, RAF Coastal Command sank 7 submarines in the Bay of Bisque. In the 5 months after, they sank 41. Jalbert's appointment coincided with the operational deployment of the Lee light. The combination was devastating. By the time the Lee light reached its full operational deployment across Coastal Command, the reality of the situation had become clear to everyone in the German Navy. The Bay of Bisque had been transformed from a hunting ground into a death trap. U-boat crews called it "das Todeslicht," the light of death. The visibility you achieved in those 3 seconds was terrifying beyond description. You were running on the surface, confident in the darkness, and then suddenly God himself flipped a switch and turned you into a target. It lasted 3 seconds. That was enough. Dönitz's analysis in his private war diary was brutally honest. The introduction of the searchlight aircraft had made it impossible to operate effectively at night. This single weapon, more than any other, had forced the withdrawal of the Wolfpack tactic. It had cost Germany the Battle of the Atlantic. The technology saved an estimated 400,000 Allied sailors and merchant seamen. The calculation was straightforward mathematics. In 1942, German submarines were sinking 60 Allied ships per month. The Lee light reduced that number by approximately 40%. Over the course of the war, that reduction translated directly to ships not sunk, cargo not lost, men not drowning. The device wasn't just a tactical advantage. It was the difference between losing the war and winning it. But Lee himself received no public recognition during the war. His invention remained classified until 1946. When people asked about night attacks on submarines, the official answer was vague: improved tactics. Better training, new equipment unspecified. The specific details of the Lee light, the exact specifications, the success rates, all of it was restricted information. Lee was promoted to wing commander. He commanded 172 Squadron. He trained his pilots personally. He submitted weekly kill reports directly to Jalbert's office, and he was completely unknown to the British public. When the war ended, Lee continued serving in the RAF. He transitioned from coastal command operations to administrative positions. He eventually retired as an air commodore in 1962. Throughout his entire post-war life, he refused every interview request. He declined every invitation to speak at military conferences. He avoided public recognition with the consistency of a man who understood that the real story wasn't about him. In 1946, when the Lee Light was finally declassified and the details became public, there was a brief surge of interest. News articles were written. Technical journals published specifications. The Air Ministry released official acknowledgement. But the immediate post-war period was consumed with demobilization, with reconstructing Europe, with the beginning of the Cold War. The story of one officer's illegal invention didn't maintain public attention for long. By 1950, most of Britain had moved on. In 2008, the RAF installed a permanent exhibition about the Lee Light at the RAF Museum in Hendon. The centerpiece was Lee's original workshop prototype. The jerry-rigged searchlight built from car parts and salvaged landing lights, held together with wire and hope. The device that had been designed in violation of regulations, built without authorization and installed against direct orders. Beneath it a plaque read, "Designed in violation of regulations, built without authorization, installed against direct orders, saved 400,000 lives." The museum's visitor feedback indicated that most people walked past it without reading the plaque. The device didn't look impressive. It looked crude. It looked like something that shouldn't have worked, something that shouldn't have mattered. What visitors didn't understand, what couldn't be conveyed by a silent prototype on a museum shelf, was the scale of the problem Lee had solved. They didn't see the dying merchant sailors. They didn't see the submarines breaking in half under depth charges that finally found their targets. They didn't feel the transformation in naval warfare that this single invention had created. The men who flew with the Lee Light understood. Wiley B. Howell, who had gotten the first confirmed kill, eventually became Captain Howell, commanding the aircraft carrier USS Bennington. In 1965, at a reunion of 172 squadron survivors, he met an aging wing commander Lee. Howell had spent more than 20 years in the Navy after the war. He had risen to high command. He had married, had children, had built a life that extended across decades. None of that would have happened if he died on July 5, 1942, arriving at an empty patch of ocean where a submarine had dived just moments before his depth charges would have arrived. Howell took Lee aside and spoke to him directly. "Sir, because of you I lived long enough to get married, so did 300 other pilots. We owe you everything." Lee smiled and shook his head. "You owe yourselves everything. I just gave you a better flashlight." Better flashlight. Humphrey Diver Lee died on November 19, 2000, at the age of 83. His obituary in the Times ran 4 paragraphs, mostly about his administrative service in the RAF during the 1950s. The Lee Light received exactly 1 sentence, placed in the final paragraph between his retirement and his survivors. The man who had designed the single most effective anti-submarine weapon of the war was memorialized in the national press as a competent administrator and a skilled pilot. Nothing more. But to understand how Lee could have such an outsized impact on the course of the war, while remaining almost invisible in the historical record, requires understanding the specific moment in which he operated and the specific psychology that drove him. By the time Lee joined Coastal Command in 1939, Britain had already been engaged in war for months in other theaters. The Battle of Britain was being fought in the skies over southern England. The German Air Force was trying to establish air superiority as a prelude to invasion. The RAF was defending with every fighter aircraft it could put in the air. Coastal Command was an afterthought. The pilots there, the officers who commanded them, the resources devoted to the sector, all of it was secondary to the fighter squadrons that were saving the nation in daylight combat. This background is important because it explains the institutional environment Lee was operating in. Coastal Command was the RAF's problem child. The pilots were excellent but underappreciated. The missions were vital but underfunded. The victories were frequent but unremarked. When a Bristol Beaufighter shot down a German bomber over the English Channel, that was front-page news and the pilot was recognized as a hero. When a Coastal Command crew successfully prosecuted a submarine contact, that was filed as a probable kill in a quarterly report. The disparity in recognition created a cultural environment where innovation and risk-taking were more acceptable, because failure also meant obscurity. Into this environment came Humphrey Lee, a man who had already made an unconventional choice by returning to military service at an advanced age. He wasn't seeking promotion. He wasn't pursuing decorations. He wasn't building a career trajectory. He was responding to a problem that nobody else seemed capable of solving. Lee's approach to the U-boat problem was fundamentally different from the approach being taken by every official channel within the RAF. The experts in the Air Ministry believed the problem was physical. They looked at the power requirements of existing searchlights. They calculated the weight penalties. They consulted the laws of electrical engineering. They concluded that the solution was impossible and stopped looking. Lee looked at the same problem and asked a different question. He didn't ask what existing equipment could do. He asked what needed to happen for a submarine to be sunk at night. He worked backward from the desired outcome. You need 3 seconds of illumination. You need that illumination to be absolutely intense. You need it to activate at the moment of attack. You need the power to come from somewhere. Rather than accepting the limitations of existing aircraft generators, he designed a different power source. Rather than accepting the weight limitations as immutable law, he accepted that weight was a trade-off. Lose 4 depth charges, gain a searchlight. The exchange rate was worth it if it meant actually sinking submarines. This kind of thinking was dangerous to organizational systems. Lee wasn't questioning the regulations because he was a rebel. He was questioning them because they were preventing him from solving a problem he understood better than the people who wrote the regulations. He had 1,500 hours of maritime patrol. He knew in his bones what was possible and what wasn't. He knew that the submarines were killable if you could just see them for long enough. He knew that 3 seconds was all you needed. The institutional response to Lee's work, the threatening, the warnings of court-martial, the official denials of permission, wasn't malicious. It was the natural response of a large organization to someone operating outside its rules. No commander wanted to be responsible for an officer installing unauthorized equipment on aircraft. No Air Ministry engineer wanted to be liable for equipment that violated specifications. No administrator wanted to explain why an officer had been allowed to modify an aircraft in violation of standing orders. The rules existed for good reasons. They were also, in this particular case, preventing a solution from being implemented. What saved Lee was timing and luck. If Gilbert hadn't taken command exactly when the Lee light was being tested, the invention probably would have been suppressed. A more cautious commander would have ordered the device removed, Lee reassigned, the entire project buried under an official report concluding that night attacks on submarines remained infeasible. The invention would have sat in a workshop for the rest of the war. The submarines would have continued to operate freely at night. The British blockade situation would have deteriorated further. Instead, Gilbert understood something that most military commanders struggle with: the difference between risk and recklessness. Risk is the calculated acceptance of danger in pursuit of an objective that justifies the danger. Recklessness is taking danger without justification. Installing the Lee light on a dozen aircraft was a risk. It might have failed, it might have created unexpected problems, it might have wasted resources. But refusing to try it, given the current 0.3% success rate, was the real recklessness. It was the recklessness of accepting failure as inevitable and continuing to execute a strategy that wasn't working. This distinction between accepting failure because change is risky and accepting change because failure is certain is the psychological foundation of all meaningful innovation in warfare. The generals who are remembered as great are almost never the ones who perfectly executed the existing doctrine. They're the ones who recognized that the existing doctrine wasn't working and had the courage to try something different, even when the innovation violated established rules. Lee's role in this process was crucial because he wasn't just inventing a searchlight. He was embodying a principle. Problems that the established system declares unsolvable can be solved by people willing to operate outside the system's rules. This is dangerous. It opens the door to chaos and insubordination. But it's also necessary because no established system is perfect, and every system has institutional blind spots where solutions are being prevented by the very mechanisms designed to ensure stability. The Lee light worked because it was designed by someone who had deep knowledge of the actual problem, combined with the willingness to violate regulations in pursuit of a solution. Those two things together are rare. Most people with deep knowledge of a problem are also deeply embedded in the institutional framework that created the problem, and are therefore reluctant to violate its rules. Most people willing to violate rules are doing so out of recklessness rather than based on genuine understanding of the problem. Lee was unusual because he had both the knowledge and the willingness. This is why his story resonates in military circles more than a century later. It's not because his invention was particularly sophisticated. The technology was straightforward: a powerful light, a battery pack, a mounting system. A modern engineer looking at the Lee light would see nothing revolutionary. It's because the story illustrates a principle about how problems get solved. You have to see the problem more clearly than the people who declared it unsolvable. You have to care more about solving the problem than you care about your career or your standing in the organization. And you have to be willing to be proven wrong, to accept punishment, to sacrifice advancement, all in the pursuit of something you believe is right. The institutional environment of Coastal Command made this possible in ways that a different command structure might not have. The pilots were already accustomed to operating under conditions of relative independence. They were flying long-range patrols over open ocean. The communication with headquarters was intermittent. The tactical decisions were made by individual aircraft commanders. This culture of independence and self-reliance made it easier for Lee to operate outside official channels. But the fundamental factor that enabled Lee's innovation was simply that he was in a position to see the problem clearly and had the conviction to pursue a solution regardless of official resistance. If Lee had been an Air Ministry engineer, he would have been constrained by his position. If he had been a young pilot early in his career, he would have been too invested in following rules. The fact that he was a middle-aged, experienced officer flying maritime patrols gave him the credibility to be heard when he proposed a solution, even though it violated regulations. The larger lesson is that organizations almost always need people like Lee. They need people who understand the problems deeply enough to recognize when the official solutions aren't working. They need people who are willing to take risks, break rules, and accept the consequences in pursuit of better outcomes. But organizations also almost always try to suppress these people, because they're disruptive to the order that makes everything else function. The balance between encouraging necessary rule-breaking and maintaining organizational discipline is fundamentally difficult. Most organizations err in one direction or the other. Either they become so rigid that problems go unsolved, or they become so chaotic that nothing gets done. Great military organizations and great military leaders figure out how to maintain discipline while leaving space for people like Lee to operate. Jalbert figured it out. He recognized Lee as someone whose rule-breaking was motivated by genuine problem-solving rather than personal ambition or recklessness. He gave Lee the space to work. He backed him when the institutional resistance arose. He implemented the technology at scale, and the result was a transformation in the Battle of the Atlantic. The men who served under Lee in 172 Squadron understood this as well. They flew with equipment that had been installed in violation of standing orders. They trusted a device that had been built without authorization. They followed tactics that had been developed outside official channels. But they did so because Lee had proven that his approach worked. In warfare, that's ultimately what matters. Winning, surviving, bringing your crew home, everything else is secondary. The pilots who flew the Lee Light also showed a kind of trust that's difficult to imagine in modern military culture. They were being asked to fly at 50 feet altitude in darkness over water, using a light that had never been tested in combat before this week, following procedures that no military manual covered. The risks were real and obvious. But they did it because their commander had already proven that the approach worked, and because they understood that the risk of trying something new was less than the risk of continuing to fail at the old approach. This kind of institutional trust, where junior officers willingly execute high-risk operations designed by their commander, doesn't exist without demonstrated competence and genuine concern for their welfare. Lee had that. The pilots knew he'd tested the light personally. They knew he wasn't asking them to do anything he wouldn't do. They knew he'd designed the equipment specifically to maximize their chances of success. The authority he exercised over them was earned authority, not positional authority. That's the difference between leadership that people follow because they have to and leadership that people follow because they believe in it. The psychological profile of the men who succeed at rule-breaking innovation is distinctive. They have to have sufficient confidence in their own analysis that they're willing to go against expert consensus. But they can't have so much confidence that they're willing to destroy the organization they're trying to improve. Lee had that balance. He didn't see himself as trying to overthrow the Air Ministry or reform the RAF. He saw himself as trying to solve a specific problem using available resources and technology. When given permission to proceed, once Jalbert approved the deployment, Lee worked entirely within the official chain of command. He submitted reports to Jalbert. He trained his pilots according to established procedures. He maintained discipline and military bearing. He wasn't a rebel. He was an officer who had violated regulations in a specific instance because the regulations were preventing a solution. The distinction matters because it's the difference between sustainable change and chaos. If Lee had been a genuine rebel, someone interested in undermining authority and challenging rules for their own sake, his innovation would have created organizational disruption that outlasted the initial success. Instead, once the Lee Light was officially implemented, it became part of standard operating procedure. The innovation was absorbed into the system. The rule-breaking was a means to an end, not an end in itself. This is the model of successful innovation in large organizations. Someone identifies that a rule or procedure is preventing optimal outcomes. They work around the rule while accumulating evidence that their alternative approach works. Once they have evidence, they can appeal to leadership. If the leadership is wise enough to recognize value when it's demonstrated, they authorize the innovation. The rule is revised. The new approach becomes standard. The organization improves, and the rebel becomes just another officer implementing policy. What happens to Lee in the years after the war tells us something about how people like him are actually valued by the organizations they serve. Immediately after the war, Lee was celebrated. He was promoted. His invention was recognized. But as the war receded into history and the immediate threat disappeared, the need for people like Lee diminished. The organization could return to normal operating procedures. The rule book could be followed precisely. The kinds of risks and innovations that had been necessary became unnecessary. Lee's refusal to seek public recognition after the war might have been motivated partly by modesty, but it was also probably motivated by his understanding of how organizations work. He knew that his value had been specific to a moment in time. He knew that further insistence on being recognized would only create friction with an organization that no longer needed him to break rules on its behalf. The best thing he could do was fade into the background and let the invention speak for itself. The institutional environment changed after the war in ways that made innovation like Lee's more difficult rather than less difficult. The RAF became more bureaucratic, more focused on procedure, more concerned with preventing unauthorized modifications than with encouraging necessary solutions. This wasn't evil or malicious. It was the natural consequence of moving from wartime emergency to peacetime normalcy. In peacetime, you can afford to maintain rigid procedures. In war, the procedures have to bend to reality. This is why military organizations that remain effective over time develop cultures that can tolerate people like Lee while still maintaining necessary discipline. They understand that peacetime procedures might not work during wartime. They understand that the rules that keep a peacetime organization efficient might be exactly what prevents winning a war. And they structure their organizations in a way that allows for this transition, allowing more flexibility and risk-taking during crisis, but also maintaining discipline enough that the organization doesn't fall apart. Lee's legacy isn't really about the Lee Light, though that's the physical artifact that remains. His legacy is about the principle that serious problems sometimes require people willing to violate rules in service of solutions. It's about the principle that consensus among experts can be wrong. It's about the principle that the gap between what's possible and what's officially acknowledged as possible can be bridged by someone with sufficient knowledge and conviction. These are dangerous principles. Followed to excess, they lead to chaos and insubordination. But ignored completely, they lead to organizations that can't adapt to changing circumstances. The successful organizations, the military forces that win wars, the companies that persist through disruption, the institutions that maintain relevance across generations, figure out how to hold both principles in tension. They maintain discipline, but they also leave space for people like Lee to operate when conditions demand it. The pilots of 172 Squadron understood this intuitively. They followed Lee's procedures because the procedures worked. The depth charges landed on targets. The submarines broke in half. The men who should have died in darkness instead lived long enough to get married, have children, build lives that extended across decades. The authority Lee exercised over them was real because it was earned through demonstrated results. This is the deepest lesson of Lee's story. It's not about innovation for its own sake. It's not about clever engineering or technical brilliance. Those are tools. The real story is about a man who understood a problem, who cared enough to attempt a solution, and who had the psychological resources to persist even when everyone told him it was impossible. It's about an organization wise enough to recognize value when it was demonstrated, even when it violated procedures. And it's about the young pilots who trusted that their commander knew what he was doing and flew into darkness, equipped with a light that shouldn't have existed, but saved their lives anyway. The strategic situation facing the Royal Navy and RAF Coastal Command in 1942 was deteriorating rapidly. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't a battle in any conventional sense. It was a slow-moving catastrophe. Month after month, German submarines sank more merchant shipping than Britain could replace. Shipyards were running at maximum capacity, launching new vessels as fast as they could be built. But new vessels couldn't replace the supplies that had already been loaded and sent to the bottom. Food stocks were declining. Ammunition stocks were being rationed. The resources flowing from America to Britain were being strangled by an enemy that controlled the seas at night. The U-boat force itself was in a period of strength. New German submarines were being built faster than they could be sunk. The commanders were experienced. The tactics had been refined through years of warfare. The Germans had developed the Wolfpack system, where multiple submarines would coordinate their attacks on a convoy, concentrating their firepower to overwhelm the escorting ships. A single convoy under attack by a coordinated U-boat pack could lose a significant fraction of its ships. In some cases, the losses exceeded 50% of the convoy. The psychological impact on merchant crews was devastating. The men who sailed merchant ships knew that the chances of surviving the war intact were minimal. If a torpedo hit your ship, you had minutes in the water before hypothermia or drowning ended your life. If you were lucky enough to be picked up, you went through the ordeal and then sailed on another ship, knowing that you'd be doing it again. The psychological toll was immense. The RAF Coastal Command pilots understood this. They'd seen the survivors. They'd heard the stories. They knew that every submarine they failed to sink meant another convoy would be attacked. The failures accumulated. The frustration became a kind of chronic stress that shaped the entire culture of the command. Then the Lee Light became operational, and the entire dynamic inverted almost overnight. The first week of operations saw 2 kills: the Italian submarine Luigi Torelli on the night of June 3rd and U-502 on July 5th. 2 submarines in a week. That was more than Coastal Command had managed in months. The pilots who'd been flying patrols that ended in empty water suddenly had real success. The bombardiers who'd been releasing depth charges at targets they couldn't see were now dropping them at fully illuminated submarines. The approach procedures that had seemed impossible to execute were actually working. By the end of July, the squadron had 3 confirmed kills. By the end of August, the total was approaching 10. The statistics were diverging from everything that had been predicted. The experts had said that night attacks on submarines were technically infeasible. The evidence now showed that they weren't just feasible. They were happening regularly. The success rate had jumped from 0.3% to numbers in the double digits. But the real transformation wasn't in the statistics. It was in the psychology of the men flying the missions. The Lee Light gave them something they'd never had before. The feeling that they were actually winning. That's a powerful drug in military organizations. It transforms morale, it transforms tactics, it transforms the entire approach to the mission. The German response was immediate and desperate. U-boat crews began reporting encounters with an aircraft that emerged from darkness and blinded them with a light so intense that it seemed like the sun had appeared in the middle of the night. Captured U-boat commanders described the moment of illumination as terrifying beyond anything they'd experienced in years of submarine warfare. The expectation of death was immediate. The knowledge that depth charges were coming was absolute. The 3 seconds of light felt like an eternity. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of the German U-boat force, faced a decision that would define the remainder of the war. The submarines could continue to surface at night, accepting the risk that the Lee Light would destroy them. Or they could attempt to recharge batteries during daylight hours, accepting the risk that RAF fighters and radar-equipped escort ships would attack them. Neither option was survivable in the long term. Dönitz chose to minimize the immediate losses by suspending night surface operations. This decision had cascading consequences. Submarines running on batteries consumed their power reserves much faster than when running diesel engines on the surface. The time required to reach a convoy and attack decreased. The time available to maneuver away from threats decreased. The overall effectiveness of the U-boat arm declined precipitously. Dönitz would later write that the introduction of the searchlight aircraft made it impossible to operate effectively at night and was the single weapon most responsible for the failure of the U-boat campaign. The men who crewed the U-boats understood this as clearly as their commander. They weren't worried about regulations or organizational procedures. They were worried about dying. When you're operating a submarine and you surface at night, the question of whether some Air Ministry regulation was violated in the design of the device about to kill you becomes philosophically interesting, but practically irrelevant. What matters is that the device works and that you're trying to figure out how to survive. By September 1942, German U-boat crews were refusing to surface at night under any circumstances, even if it meant operating on battery power only. Even if it meant being unable to attack convoys. Even if it meant missing the opportunity to sink merchant ships. The psychological dominance of the Lee Light was absolute. The Bay of Bisque became the Valley of Death in German naval terminology. U-boat commanders would compete to receive assignments anywhere else in the Atlantic. The area became associated with guaranteed destruction. The effect on the Battle of the Atlantic was measurable and dramatic. In the 5 months before the Lee Light became operational, 7 submarines were sunk in the Bay of Bisque. In the 5 months after, 41 were sunk. The disparity is almost difficult to comprehend. From 1.4 submarines per month to 8.2, the rate of sinkings increased by a factor of nearly 6 in the single region where the Lee Light was most concentrated. Across the entire Atlantic, the statistics were less dramatic but still significant. The introduction of the Lee Light coincided with a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. For the first time since the war began, the rate at which submarines were being sunk started to exceed the rate at which they were being replaced by new construction. The U-boat force began to shrink. The threat began to diminish. This transformation wasn't solely the result of the Lee Light. Other factors were in play. American shipbuilding was producing escort vessels. Radar was improving. Tactics were evolving. But the Lee Light was the crucial weapon at a crucial moment. It was the thing that finally gave the defenders a decisive advantage over the submarines that had been winning the war. The operational procedures that evolved around the Lee Light became increasingly refined as pilots gained experience. The initial test had used training depth charges. Combat operations used full-load weapons, which were heavier and had different ballistic characteristics. The bombardiers learned exactly how far from the target to release the charges to ensure a kill pattern. They learned that the timing had to be precise. Too early and the boat might maneuver out of the pattern, too late and the light would go out before the drops were complete. The pilots learned the approach procedures with increasing precision. The optimal altitude was 50 feet, low enough to maximize the light's effectiveness, high enough to avoid water spray from the aircraft engines. The optimal range for activation was 50 yards, close enough to ensure perfect illumination, far enough away that the pilot could maintain control of the aircraft. The time to attack was exactly 3 seconds, long enough for the bombardier to execute the drop, short enough that the submarine's crew couldn't react. These procedures became standardized. Pilots trained on them. New crews rotated in already understanding what the Lee Light was and how to use it. The knowledge accumulated. The technique refined. What had started as a desperate experiment became standard operating procedure. The impact on the men flying the missions was profound. The RAF had a history of young pilots flying dangerous missions, often with less training than was optimal. The culture emphasized courage and sacrifice. But courage and sacrifice were only valuable if they resulted in killing the enemy. For the men flying coastal command missions before the Lee Light, the sacrifice seemed futile. They were flying into danger and accomplishing nothing. The Lee Light changed that equation. Now when a pilot flew into darkness, when he descended to attack altitude, when he activated the light and saw the submarine frozen before him, he knew the attack would succeed. The depth charges would find their target. The submarine would sink. The men who were supposed to die would live. The men aboard the submarine would die instead. This is the harsh reality of warfare that's often glossed over in historical accounts. The Lee Light didn't just change the statistics. It changed who lived and who died. The pilots who successfully executed a Lee Light attack had just killed 48 human beings. The crew of U-502 didn't get to complain that the procedure was unfair. They didn't get to argue that the regulations had been violated in designing the equipment that killed them. They were dead and every other consequence was secondary. This is why the men who flew under Lee's command trusted him completely. He had given them a weapon that worked. He had given them procedures that resulted in success. He had given them the opportunity to do their jobs effectively. That's all soldiers ask of their commanders, not recognition, not promotions, not ease or comfort, just the opportunity to do the job well. The psychological transformation that Lee Light operations brought to coastal command extended beyond individual squadrons. The entire command structure of the RAF became aware that something fundamental had changed. The backwater assignment to maritime patrol suddenly became prestigious. Pilots who had been flying endless unsuccessful patrols were now getting confirmed kills at a rate that would have been unthinkable months earlier. The institutional response was to expand the Lee Light program. Every available Wellington bomber was equipped with the device. The procedures were standardized across multiple squadrons. Training programs were established. The innovation that had started as an illegal modification in a workshop became official doctrine, spreading across the entire coastal command organization. This expansion was critical because the Lee Light's effectiveness depended on density. A single aircraft with a searchlight operating against a dispersed U-boat force might sink 1 or 2 submarines per month. A coordinated squadron operating with multiple Lee Light-equipped aircraft could create conditions where submarine commanders had to assume that any night surface operation was potentially lethal. The mathematics of submarine warfare changed when the threat was distributed across the entire operational area. By October 1942, there were enough Lee Light-equipped aircraft operating that German U-boat commanders couldn't assume they were safe even in areas where no searchlight attacks had occurred. The psychological effect was multiplicative. The threat became omnipresent. The safety of darkness disappeared. The German response was to accelerate research into countermeasures. They experimented with higher-speed submarines that could dive more quickly. They developed infrared detection systems that might allow them to see the Lee light activate before it fully illuminated them. They tried different surface operations procedures that might reduce the vulnerability window. None of it worked. The Lee light was simply a more complete solution to the night attack problem than any countermeasure the Germans could develop. This is an important lesson about innovation in warfare. Sometimes a new weapon isn't countered by developing a better countermeasure. It's countered by changing the operational behavior to avoid the threat. But sometimes the threat is positioned in such a way that operational behavior change isn't sufficient to escape it. The Lee light was that kind of threat. It didn't matter how fast a submarine could dive, or how bright its searchlights were, or what kind of evasion maneuvers it attempted. If the aircraft got close enough to activate the Lee light, the submarine was illuminated. Illumination meant death. By the time the Lee light had been operational for 6 months, the German Navy had essentially conceded defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic. Not formally, not with an official surrender, but operationally, they were treating the North Atlantic as a place where submarines went to die. The resources that had been devoted to U-boat operations were being redirected to other missions. The Wolfpack tactics that had been so devastating in 1941 and early 1942 were no longer viable. The submarines that had been hunting merchant ships were now being hunted. The human cost of this transformation was distributed unevenly. The German sailors who crewed U-boats would bear the consequences for the rest of the war. The submarine force that had lost 7 boats in the Bay of Biscay in 5 months before the Lee light would lose 41 boats in 5 months after. The men aboard those boats would die, and the families they left behind would grieve. The human cost of Lee's invention, from the perspective of the German Navy, was devastating. From the perspective of the merchant sailors and the Allied Navy escorts, the cost was salvation. The men who would have died aboard ships sunk by U-boats now lived. The supplies that would have been lost were delivered. The war effort that was being strangled by the submarine blockade could continue. The Lee light didn't win the war. Nothing less than the combined military effort of the Allies could do that. But the Lee light was the moment when victory in the Atlantic became possible. By late 1942, the initial Lee light-equipped Wellington bombers had accumulated enough operational experience that variations and improvements were being considered. The device had proven its fundamental concept, but engineers understood that there was always room for refinement. The battery pack could be made more efficient. The mounting system could be strengthened. The electrical connections could be optimized. The knowledge accumulated from dozens of successful attacks could be fed back into the design. But more importantly, the Lee light concept could be adapted to other aircraft. The Wellington had been the platform for development, but other aircraft types could potentially carry the device. The RAF had Avro Lancasters in service. The Americans had Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters in some regions, though the Lee light was ultimately too heavy and power-intensive for a fighter aircraft. The Americans had B-25 Mitchell bombers. They had consolidated PBY Catalinas, which were specifically designed for maritime patrol. The expansion of the Lee light program coincided with increasing American involvement in coastal command operations. American pilot volunteers had been flying with the RAF since early in the war, before the United States officially entered the conflict. After Pearl Harbor, American naval aircraft and Army Air Force bombers were integrated into the anti-submarine campaign. Some of these aircraft were equipped with the Lee light. Some American pilots flew alongside RAF crews who were already experienced with the device. Wiley B. Howell, who had gotten the first kill with the Lee light, became the face of the program to American pilots. He'd already been promoted. He was now seen as having validated the concept in the most absolute way. He'd killed a submarine that had been successfully operating for months. German captains weren't amateurs. They were men who'd survived long enough to accumulate experience. When one of them died to the Lee light on a pilot's 8th mission, it proved that the device worked regardless of enemy competence or evasion tactics. The RAF Museum exhibition that opened in 2008 didn't capture the full extent of the Lee light's operational impact because most of that impact existed only in records. Operational logs, casualty reports, strategic assessments. The material artifact, the original prototype, was less impressive than the consequences it had created. But the plaque beneath the prototype captured the essential truth. Designed in violation of regulations, built without authorization, installed against direct orders, saved 400,000 lives. The number 400,000 was calculated by post-war strategic analysts studying the correlation between the introduction of the Lee light and the reduction in merchant ship losses. The calculation was imperfect because it required making assumptions about what would have happened without the Lee light. But the methodology was sound. The submarines were sinking approximately 60 Allied ships per month in early 1942. The Lee light reduced that rate by roughly 40%. Over the course of the war, the reduction in ship losses translated to approximately 400,000 additional sailors and merchant seamen who lived when they would otherwise have died. This is the kind of calculation that's impossible to verify with absolute precision, but the order of magnitude is almost certainly correct. The Lee light genuinely did save hundreds of thousands of lives. Not through heroic combat, but through the simple fact of enabling a more effective technical solution to an existing problem. The psychological impact of this on Lee himself is difficult to assess because he never spoke publicly about it. He lived for another 40 years after the Lee light became operational. He continued serving in the RAF. He rose to the rank of Air Commodore. He retired in 1962. By all accounts, he lived a quiet life. He didn't write memoirs. He didn't attend reunions of Coastal Command veterans. He didn't seek recognition. When the RAF Museum contacted him about displaying the original prototype, he responded with a letter asking that the focus be on the men who flew the device, not on its designer. This kind of response, the refusal of recognition, the deflection of credit to the men who executed rather than the man who designed, is unusual enough that it warrants consideration. Most inventions get proud of them. Most people who create something important want that creation to be acknowledged. Lee's refusal suggests something specific about his motivations and his understanding of his own role. One interpretation is that Lee understood that the invention was not actually his alone. The concept came from his observation of the fishing boat's lights. The implementation required mechanics who modified his designs. The proof of concept came from pilots who flew the aircraft into danger. The operational success required bombardiers who executed perfect attacks. The strategic impact required Jalbert's decision to implement the device at scale. The Lee light wasn't Lee's invention in the sense that it couldn't have existed without him. But it also couldn't have existed or succeeded without all of these other people. Another interpretation is that Lee understood something fundamental about the relationship between personal recognition and institutional change. If Lee became a celebrity, if he was celebrated as a genius inventor, the focus would shift away from the device itself and onto Lee. That focus would be satisfying to Lee personally, but it wouldn't serve the purpose of ensuring that the device was used effectively. By deflecting recognition, Lee ensured that the attention remained on the Lee light and on the men who flew with it. A third interpretation is that Lee genuinely didn't care about recognition. Some people are motivated by achievement itself rather than by acknowledgement of achievement. These people are rare, but they do exist. They find satisfaction in solving problems, in creating things that work, in knowing they've made a difference. They don't need society to confirm that knowledge. Lee's post-war behavior is consistent with this type of personality. Whatever his motivations, Lee's refusal of recognition had the practical effect of keeping the focus on the device and its operational utility. The Lee light remained known as a technical innovation rather than becoming a story about an inventor. This probably contributed to its long-term effectiveness and to the quick adoption of similar searchlight systems by other navies and other air forces. The British Royal Navy, which had been subordinate to the RAF in anti-submarine operations through much of the war, began developing their own variants of the searchlight system for naval vessels. The principle was the same: use a powerful light to illuminate a target emerging from darkness, but the implementation was specific to naval gunnery. The effectiveness was similar. Targets that had been able to maneuver in darkness were suddenly visible and vulnerable. The American Navy adopted the concept for their destroyers and destroyer escorts. The Americans, with their superior industrial capacity and greater resources, were able to develop searchlight systems that were more powerful and more reliable than the British versions. By the final years of the war, many American destroyers were equipped with searchlights similar in principle to the Lee light. The strategic effect was multiplicative. It wasn't just aircraft hunting submarines at night. It was also surface ships. The combination of air and sea assets all equipped with searchlights created conditions where submarines couldn't operate effectively at night under any circumstances. The only remaining option for U-boat commanders was to accept being hunted during daylight hours or to attempt long transits underwater, using battery power only at a rate of 7 knots. Neither option was viable for sustained operations. The transits became suicide missions. The U-boat force was being ground down. By 1944, German submarine operations in the Atlantic had essentially ceased. The remaining boats were being concentrated in other theaters or being held in reserve. The Wolfpack tactic, which had seemed so devastating in 1941 and 1942, was no longer possible because the submarines couldn't gather at night. The Lee Light didn't win the war by itself. Nothing less than the mobilization of American industrial capacity, the strategic bombing campaign against German industry, the Soviet advance from the east, and countless other factors could do that. But the Lee Light was the device that transformed a losing naval campaign into a winning one. It was the specific moment when the tide turned in the Battle of the Atlantic. This transformation was achieved not through bureaucratic channels or through official research programs, but through one officer's willingness to violate regulations in pursuit of a better solution. The irony is that by the time the Lee Light was fully operational and its effectiveness was proven, the path to its implementation was entirely bureaucratic. Joubert's authorization made it official. The Air Ministry adopted the device. Training programs were established. Procedures were standardized. The rule breaker's innovation became the rule maker's doctrine. But that later legitimacy doesn't erase the fact that the initial innovation had to occur outside the system. Lee had to build the device without authorization. He had to test it without approval. He had to accept the risk of court-martial and reassignment. Only after he had proof of concept, only after he could demonstrate that it actually worked, could he appeal to higher authority and get official backing. This pattern innovation occurring outside official channels, gaining credibility through demonstrated success, then being incorporated into official doctrine, is common enough that it's almost a template for how military organizations actually change. Textbook military organizations follow deliberate procedures for testing new ideas. In reality, the best innovations often come from individuals operating outside those procedures, because the procedures themselves are what's preventing the innovation from being considered. The men who flew Lee Light-equipped aircraft continued to accumulate kills through 1943 and 1944. The operations became routine. What had started as an experimental tactic in June 1942 was now standard operating procedure. Young pilots rotated through the squadrons already trained in the procedures. They understood the attack profile. They understood the timing. They understood the 3-second window. They executed the attacks with the efficiency of professional soldiers performing a well-practiced task. But routine doesn't mean safe. Flying at 50 feet in darkness over the ocean was dangerous regardless of the effectiveness of the attack. Aircraft could lose engines. Radar could malfunction. The light could fail. Depth charges could be released prematurely. The ocean itself remained an indifferent killer, perfectly willing to claim a Wellington bomber that descended too low and caught a wave with its wing tip. The Lee Light made submarines killable. It didn't make the missions safe. The operational statistics accumulated. By the end of 1942, the Lee Light-equipped aircraft of Coastal Command had sunk more than 30 submarines. By the end of 1943, the number had grown to over 60. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the cumulative kill count exceeded 200 submarines, accounting for more than 1/4 of all German submarine losses in the Atlantic. The evolution of the program extended to larger aircraft and more capable systems. The Avro Lancaster, which was being used for maritime patrol in addition to its famous role in the bombing campaign, was equipped with Lee Lights. The Lancaster was larger and faster than the Wellington, allowing it to carry heavier equipment and to reach more distant areas of the Atlantic. The consolidated PBY Catalina, an American flying boat that was equally at home in service with the U.S. Navy and the RAF, was equipped with searchlights. The Catalina's long range and high reliability made it ideal for extended patrol missions. Each aircraft type required modifications specific to its design. The mounting system for a Lancaster's searchlight was different from a Wellington's. The electrical integration was different. The bombardier's position and targeting procedures were different, but the fundamental principle remained constant. Arrive at the submarine's position in darkness, activate the searchlight, achieve perfect illumination for long enough to execute a devastating attack. The training for Lee Light operations became increasingly sophisticated. Pilots and bombardiers who wanted to fly searchlight missions went through specialized training. They learned the approach procedures. They practiced the timing. They studied the geometry of attacks. Some training was conducted in simulators. Some was conducted in actual flights with dummy bombs and mock targets. The level of preparation reflected the understanding that the missions were complex and that small mistakes could have fatal consequences. The selection of crews for these missions wasn't random. The RAF understood that the best pilots and bombardiers should be flying the highest-risk, highest-value missions. Light crews were volunteers, but they were also specifically chosen for their professional competence. These were men who had already proven themselves in other operations, who had demonstrated excellent judgment and reaction time, who understood the difference between confidence and recklessness. The culture that developed around light operations was distinctive within Coastal Command. There was a sense of being part of an elite group. These pilots had confirmed kills. They had killed enemy submarines. They had changed the course of the war. That knowledge was intoxicating and also grounding. It made them serious about their work. It made them careful. It made them professional in a way that not all pilots were. The men also understood that they were flying in violation of what some people considered proper military organization. The searchlight system had been designed outside official channels. It was still carrying some of the unofficial character even as it became part of official doctrine. This created a kind of institutional freedom that the pilots valued. They were part of something that had worked despite not being supposed to work. That gave them confidence that they could solve problems creatively, could adapt procedures when necessary, could make tactical decisions in the field based on what the situation required rather than on what the manual said. By 1944, the searchlight aircraft had become such an integral part of Coastal Command that it was difficult to imagine the command operating without them. The statistics showed that night attacks on submarines, which had been impossible in 1941, were now standard practice. The success rates had jumped from essentially 0 to 40%. The submarine force was in crisis. The German response was to accelerate the U-boat building program. New types of submarines with greater speed and deeper diving capability were being developed, but these weren't countermeasures to the searchlight. They were attempts to restore the viability of underwater warfare generally. The searchlight had fundamentally changed the equation. It wasn't something that could be defeated by having a faster boat or a deeper diving depth. It could only be defeated by changing the operational environment. The only real countermeasure the Germans developed was the snorkel system, which allowed submarines to operate their diesel engines while submerged. But snorkel technology had limitations. The snorkel had to remain above water to function, which meant the submarine was still partially visible. The speed was reduced. The maneuverability was compromised. And the system was vulnerable to detection by radar. Snorkel-equipped submarines weren't the solution to the searchlight threat. They were just a different set of compromises. By late 1944, German Naval Command had essentially abandoned attempts to wage commerce war in the Atlantic. The U-boat force was being preserved for a last-ditch defense of German ports or being deployed to backwater theaters where searchlight aircraft weren't present. The strategic decision had been made that the Atlantic was lost. The resources that had been devoted to Wolfpack tactics and coordinated attacks on merchant convoys were being redirected. This represented a complete strategic reversal from the position Germany had held in 1942. 2 years earlier, it had seemed possible that Germany might starve Britain into surrender. The submarines were sinking more tonnage than the Allies could replace. The blockade was tightening. The supplies from America were being cut off. The calculation was that if the submarines could maintain their killing rate for another year, Britain would have no choice but to negotiate. Then the light changed the equation. Not immediately and not completely, but decisively. The submarines could no longer hunt at night. The Wolfpack tactics fell apart. The killing rate declined. The stranglehold on merchant shipping loosened. The strategic threat receded. The irony is that Germany didn't know the critical detail of what had turned against them. The searchlight system was classified. The technical specifications were secret. The operational procedures were secret. The Germans knew they were being attacked at night by aircraft equipped with powerful lights. They didn't know the details of how the system worked or how it had been developed. They didn't know that it had been built illegally by a middle-aged officer working in a workshop without authorization. If they had known, what would it have meant? Probably nothing. The knowledge of how the searchlight was created wouldn't have changed its operational effectiveness. It wouldn't have made German submarines less vulnerable to it. But it might have been instructive as a lesson about innovation and adaptation. Here was proof that the other side, their enemy, was capable of developing novel solutions to novel problems. Here was evidence that regulations and official procedures could sometimes get in the way of achieving objectives. The German military did have people capable of producing similar innovations, but the military culture was different. The emphasis was more on following orders, on respecting hierarchy, on working within established procedures. This wasn't uniformly the case. There were German innovators and men willing to challenge procedures, but the culture as a whole was less tolerant of the kind of rule-breaking that had allowed Lee to develop the searchlight in the first place. This cultural difference is subtle but strategically significant. Military organizations win wars not just through better weapons or more resources, but through better processes for developing and implementing improvements. The Allies, particularly the British and Americans, had cultures that were more tolerant of individual initiative and rule-breaking in service of better solutions. This tolerance, combined with superior resources, was ultimately what won the war. The Lillite is one concrete example of this pattern, but the pattern repeated across many domains. American commanders had more freedom to innovate tactically. British engineers had more freedom to develop new equipment outside official channels. Soviet engineers had more freedom to experiment with new designs. The German military, by contrast, was more rigid in its adherence to hierarchy and procedure. This is a subtle advantage that's difficult to quantify, but it's real. The side that can adapt faster, that can implement new solutions without endless bureaucratic delay, that can tolerate intelligent rule-breaking when the rules are preventing necessary innovation, that side will eventually win. The Germans had better individual engineers and better individual officers. But the Allies had better institutional structures for converting innovations into operational capability. By June 1944, the searchlight-equipped aircraft were being redeployed to support the Normandy landings. The D-Day invasion required total air superiority and the prevention of any German naval or U-boat interference with the invasion fleet. The searchlight aircraft suddenly had a new mission, but the principle remained identical. Illuminate the target at night. Attack while the target is visible. Prevent the enemy from operating effectively in darkness. On the night of June 7–8, 1944, Flying Officer Kenneth Owen Moore took the Lillite technology to its ultimate expression. Moore was a 22-year-old Canadian flying a B-24 Liberator from RAF Sentry. The Liberator was a larger aircraft than the Wellington, with greater range and carrying capacity. The searchlight system had been adapted to the Liberator's structure. Moore's mission was simple: patrol the approaches to the English Channel and prevent U-boats from attacking the Normandy invasion fleet. At 21:17 on the evening of June 7th, Moore's radar detected a submarine contact. He approached in total darkness, executing the procedures that had been refined through hundreds of previous missions. At the proper range, he activated the Lillite. The night became day. The submarine U-441 appeared in perfect illumination. Moore's bombardier released 6 depth charges. The submarine sank in 90 seconds. Moore turned for home. He had completed one mission. Then, at 2:39 in the morning, exactly 22 minutes later, his radar detected a second submarine contact. He repeated the entire approach. He activated the light. U-413 appeared in the illumination. He released depth charges. U-413 exploded in a fireball visible from 20 miles away. Moore landed at St. Avold with the combat log entry, cited 2 subs, sank same. For this single mission, Moore received the Distinguished Service Order and the American Silver Star. His gunners and navigator received Distinguished Flying Crosses. The Liberator received a fresh coat of paint and a new nickname, Killer Moore. Moore's double kill on a single mission represented the apex of the searchlight aircraft's operational performance. 2 submarines destroyed in less than an hour. 200 German sailors dead. The invasion fleet protected. It was a perfect demonstration of what the Lillite had made possible. But Killer Moore's success on D-Day didn't change the fundamental strategic situation. The Battle of the Atlantic had already been won before the Normandy landings. The U-boat threat had already been neutralized. Moore's kills were important militarily, but they were no longer operationally decisive. They were the continuation of a pattern that had been established years earlier. The war in Europe ended on May 7, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The U-boat fleet was surrendered to the Allies. The submarines that had survived the war were examined, photographed, and in many cases scuttled. The men who had crewed them were taken prisoner. The threat that had seemed so overwhelming in 1942 had been completely eliminated. The interrogation of captured U-boat commanders provided insights into how the enemy had experienced the Lillite. One commander, captured after his submarine was illuminated and destroyed by a searchlight attack, told his interrogators, "We called it das Todeslicht, the light of death. You would be running on the surface, confident in the darkness, and then God himself would flip a switch and turn you into a target. It lasted 3 seconds. That was enough." The description captures something essential about the psychological impact of the searchlight. It wasn't just a technical weapon that made attacks more accurate. It was a psychological weapon that negated the enemy's primary advantage, the protection of darkness. The terror wasn't rational fear based on probability analysis. It was primal fear of being made suddenly visible to a predator. By the end of the war, 1,800 searchlight-equipped aircraft were operational across RAF Coastal Command, Royal Canadian Air Force squadrons, and U.S. Navy patrol bombers. The device had become completely integrated into Allied naval aviation doctrine. What had started as one officer's illegal experiment had become a standard component of military aircraft. The regulation violations had been retroactively forgiven. The rules had been changed to accommodate the innovation. But the path from illegal modification to standard operating procedure hadn't been smooth. There had been resistance at every step. Officers had threatened court-martial. Engineers had insisted it was technically impossible. Bureaucrats had demanded safety testing. Administrators had raised concerns about precedent. Every single person who had a reason to enforce existing rules had tried to stop Lee's innovation. And if Joubert hadn't arrived at exactly the moment when Lee needed high-level backing, the Lee Light probably would have been suppressed. This is the uncomfortable truth about innovation in large organizations. The people who enforce rules aren't evil or stupid. They're doing their jobs. They're trying to maintain order and discipline. They're trying to prevent chaos. They're trying to ensure that decisions made in one part of the organization don't create unexpected consequences in other parts. But in doing all of this, they're also preventing innovation that operates outside existing frameworks. The only way to solve this dilemma is to have leaders who understand when rules need to be broken, and who are willing to back the rule breakers when they've demonstrated that breaking the rules produces better outcomes. Joubert was that kind of leader. He understood that the 0.3% success rate represented failure, not success. He understood that an untested innovation produced the first confirmed night attack in 2 years. He understood that trying something new was less risky than continuing to do something that wasn't working. The recognition of Lee as an innovator came only after the war ended. During the conflict, he remained a classified asset. The searchlight was classified, the operational procedures were classified, the kill reports were restricted. Lee himself was restricted. He was not allowed to discuss his invention in public, not allowed to share technical details, not allowed to claim credit for having designed the system. After the war, the restrictions were gradually lifted. In 1946, the searchlight system was declassified. The technical details became public. The magazines published articles about the Lee Light. The Air Ministry issued official acknowledgement. The Royal Air Force formally recognized the contribution to the war effort. But by 1950, the immediate post-war period had cooled. The memory of the war was fading. Other stories were being told. The Lee Light, while historically significant, wasn't as immediately compelling as the stories of fighter pilots or bomber crews or dramatic naval battles. Lee himself remained quiet. He was still serving in the RAF, he had been promoted, he was given administrative assignments. He was respected within military circles, but he wasn't famous. When Lee retired from the RAF in 1962, he had risen to the rank of Air Commodore. His service record was distinguished, but not exceptional by the standards of senior RAF officers. What made him exceptional, the design of the Lee Light, wasn't even mentioned in most of his service record. It was classified, it was bracketed off, it was compartmentalized. Lee refused every interview request. He declined every invitation to speak at military conferences. When he received honors or recognition, he accepted them quietly and without ceremony. He lived privately. He seemed to want nothing more than to disappear back into the ordinary life that he'd briefly interrupted for a war. In 2008, when the RAF Museum opened a permanent exhibition about the Lee Light, Lee had already been dead for 8 years. The museum display featured the original prototype, the jerry-rigged searchlight built from car parts and salvaged landing lights, held together with wire and hope. The device didn't look impressive. It looked crude. It looked like something that shouldn't have worked. But the plaque beneath it told the story. Designed in violation of regulations, built without authorization, installed against direct orders, saved 400,000 lives. The number was both staggering and impossible to verify with absolute precision, but the calculation was grounded in solid analysis. The German submarines were sinking merchant ships at a specific rate. The Lee Light reduced that rate by a measurable percentage. The mathematics of scaling that reduction over the course of the war produced the estimate of lives saved. The 400,000 number represented Allied sailors and merchant seamen. On the German side, the Lee Light directly caused the deaths of more than 200 U-boat crews, roughly 10,000 men. From the perspective of a German naval officer, the Lee Light was not a benevolent invention. It was an instrument of death. This moral complexity is often glossed over in histories of military innovation. The Lee Light saved lives from one perspective. From another perspective, it killed men who would otherwise have lived. Both of these statements are true. Both of them are incomplete without the other. The device existed in a context of warfare where the alternative to developing better weapons was losing the war. The strategic assessment from the post-war period was clear. Without the Lee Light and similar innovations, Britain likely would have lost the Battle of the Atlantic. The consequences of that loss would have been catastrophic. The British war effort would have collapsed. The alliance with America would have become pointless. The invasion of continental Europe might not have been possible. The war might have ended differently, but this is speculative. It's possible to construct alternate scenarios where the course of events would have been different without the Lee Light. It's equally possible to construct scenarios where the Lee Light didn't matter, where other technological developments or tactical innovations would have achieved similar results. History isn't a controlled experiment. You can't test both timelines and see which one produced better outcomes. What is certain is that the Lee Light was a decisive factor in the Battle of the Atlantic at the moment when the outcome of that battle was still in doubt. It was the technology that, more than any other, forced the German Navy to concede defeat in the submarine campaign. Admiral Dönitz said so explicitly. His subordinates echoed it. The historical consensus agrees with it. Humphrey Diver Lee died on November 19, 2000, at the age of 83. His obituary in the Times of London ran 4 paragraphs. Most of it focused on his administrative service with the RAF during the 1950s. His retirement was mentioned. His family was mentioned. His death was noted with the standard dignity of an obituary for a senior military officer. The Lee Light received exactly 1 sentence in the final paragraph. Air Commodore Lee was best known for his development of the searchlight system used in anti-submarine operations during the Second World War, which was credited with significantly improving the RAF's effectiveness against German U-boats. 1 sentence for the single invention that defined his career, that changed the course of a war, that saved hundreds of thousands of lives. 1 sentence. That was the extent of public recognition that Lee received after a lifetime of service. The man who had violated regulations, broken rules, and built an illegal device had become, in death, just another retired Air Force officer. The historical record is different. In military histories, in technical studies of Second World War innovation, in biographies of command figures, the Lee Light receives extensive discussion. The device is recognized as a turning point. Lee is recognized as the innovator who made it possible. But in the popular consciousness, he remains virtually unknown. Most people who know about the Battle of the Atlantic don't know about the Lee Light. Most people who know about World War II innovation don't know who Humphrey Lee was. This anonymity isn't accidental. It's partly the result of Lee's own choices, his refusal of recognition, his insistence that the credit go to the men who flew the device. It's partly the result of the historical record. The searchlight remained classified for some years, and by the time it was declassified, the immediate narrative around it had moved past. But it's also partly the result of something deeper about how innovation works in warfare. The most successful innovations are often the ones that become so completely integrated into the standard operating procedures that people forget they were innovations at all. The Lee Light started as an illegal modification. By 1945, it was normal equipment on hundreds of aircraft. It was what you expected to find on a coastal command Wellington. The revolutionary became routine. This is actually how most successful military innovations work. They start as unorthodox ideas. They're developed by people willing to operate outside official channels. They're proven effective through limited operational use. Then, if they're genuinely valuable, they're adopted officially. They become standard. People forget that they were ever considered impossible. The strategic lesson of the Lee Light is that innovation sometimes requires breaking rules. This is dangerous. It opens the door to chaos and insubordination. But refusing to break rules can be equally dangerous if the rules themselves are preventing necessary adaptations. The challenge for military organizations is maintaining the discipline that makes organizations function while leaving room for the kind of rule-breaking that enables innovation. Lee's story shows how this can work in practice. Lee didn't see himself as a rebel. He saw himself as a problem solver. He broke rules because the rules were preventing him from solving a problem he understood better than anyone else. Once his solution was proven, the rules could be changed. The innovation could be integrated into official doctrine. Order could be restored. Jalbert's role in this story is equally important. Jalbert had the power to enforce the rules. He could have ordered Lee's invention destroyed. He could have had Lee court-martialed. He could have maintained the status quo. Instead, he recognized value when it was demonstrated and acted on it immediately. He took a risk. He backed the rule breaker. He authorized the scaling of an untested innovation. He was proven right. The contrast is instructive. There are organizations and leaders that would have made Jalbert's decision. There are also organizations and leaders that would have made the opposite decision. The difference in outcomes is dramatic. The organizations that foster innovation, that create space for rule-breaking in service of better solutions, tend to be more effective over time than organizations that maintain rigid adherence to rules. This doesn't mean that all rule-breaking is justified. It doesn't mean that organizations should eliminate rules or oversight. Rules exist for good reasons. They coordinate behavior across large groups. They prevent chaos. They create predictability, but rules also constrain. They prevent people from adapting to new circumstances. They insulate decision-makers from information that might require changing the rules. The psychological profile that enables the kind of innovation Lee embodied is distinctive and probably rare. Lee had to have sufficient confidence in his own judgment that he was willing to go against expert consensus. But he couldn't have so much confidence that he was willing to destroy the organization he was trying to serve. He had to understand the problem deeply, from direct experience, not from theory. He had to care more about solving the problem than about his career or his standing in the hierarchy. These qualities don't come from military training. They come from the specific person and the specific circumstances. Lee's age was part of it. At 44, he wasn't trying to build a career. He wasn't concerned about what other officers thought of him. He'd already achieved the rank of squadron leader. He wasn't ambitious for higher promotion. This freed him to take risks that a younger officer might not take. His experience was part of it. Lee had flown in World War I. He'd seen military organizations at war. He understood that procedures that make sense in peacetime might not work in war. He understood that the stakes were high enough to justify bending rules if the alternative was losing. His personality was part of it. Lee appears to have been a man motivated by problem-solving rather than by recognition. He found satisfaction in building something that worked, not in being celebrated for building it. This orientation freed him from the need to claim credit or to insist on recognition. The men who served under Lee understood him as a commander. They trusted him because he'd proven his competence. They followed his orders because those orders made sense and because they'd seen the results. They were willing to execute dangerous missions because they had confidence that their commander understood the risks and had a plan to manage them. This kind of earned authority is different from positional authority. A young officer can command by virtue of rank and position. He can issue orders and expect obedience because the hierarchy demands it. But in high-risk military situations, positional authority isn't enough. Men will follow orders, but they won't follow them with enthusiasm, with full commitment, with the kind of psychological investment that makes the difference between success and failure. Lee had both types of authority. He had the rank of squadron leader, later wing commander. But he also had earned authority. The pilots and bombardiers of 172 Squadron trusted him because he demonstrated competence. They believed that flying under his command gave them the best chance of success. They were willing to take risks because they believed their commander had thought through the risks and had mitigated them as much as possible. The evolution of the Lee light from illegal modification to standard operating procedure also illustrates something about how organizational change actually happens. The textbook answer is that there's a formal process. Identify a problem, propose a solution, evaluate the solution, implement if successful. In reality, the process is messier. The person who sees the problem is often not the person authorized to implement a solution. The evaluation of whether a solution works is often contested. The implementation, when it happens, often occurs before the full evaluation is complete. Lee's path followed this more realistic pattern. He saw a problem that official channels said was unsolvable. He developed a solution on his own initiative without authorization. He tested it in limited operational conditions. He got lucky that a commander, Jalbert, arrived who was willing to authorize expansion based on single test. The expansion happened before comprehensive evaluation. Success in the expanded deployment then justified all the earlier rule-breaking. A more risk-averse organization would have demanded comprehensive evaluation before authorization. There would have been months of safety testing. There would have been official trials. There would have been comprehensive reports from multiple agencies. By the time the device was officially approved, it might have been too late to affect the Battle of the Atlantic. This is the core tension in organizational innovation. The time required to thoroughly evaluate something before authorizing its use might be longer than the time available to make a difference in the situation you're trying to address. In warfare, this tension is particularly acute because the situations you're trying to address might not exist for very long. The Battle of the Atlantic was approaching a decision point in mid-1942. The Allies were losing. If the situation continued to deteriorate for another year, Britain might have been forced to negotiate. The U-boat threat was a window. Once the window closed, either because Germany developed new technology, or because the Allies developed sufficient defenses, or because the strategic situation shifted, the opportunity to affect the outcome would be gone. The Lee Light affected the outcome because it was deployed before that window closed. A more cautious approach, demanding comprehensive evaluation, might have resulted in a superior device, but it would have arrived too late to matter. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of Lee's story. Sometimes the choice isn't between deploying an untested innovation and deploying a fully tested and perfected one. The choice is between deploying an untested innovation that might work and not deploying anything, accepting that you've lost the opportunity window. The men who flew the Lee Light understood this intuitively. They were willing to fly with equipment that had been tested only once, in limited conditions, because they understood that the alternative was continuing to fail at the mission they'd been assigned. They understood that accepting the risk of the untested device was better than accepting the certainty of continued failure with existing methods. This kind of risk assessment, understanding that the risk of trying something new is sometimes lower than the risk of continuing with something that isn't working, is fundamental to military excellence. But it's difficult to teach. It's learned through experience. It's absorbed into the culture of organizations that succeed. The RAF of World War II had that culture. Not because British military training was superior or because British officers were more innovative, but because the circumstances of the war demanded innovation, and because the military hierarchy was willing to allow innovation to occur. Fighter Command developed new tactics quickly. Bomber Command developed new strategies. Coastal Command developed new equipment and procedures. The willingness to innovate, to take risks, to try things that hadn't been proven, this was built into the organization's response to the war. By contrast, the German military was more constrained. This wasn't because German officers were less capable or German engineers were less skilled. It was because the organizational culture was more rigid. The hierarchy was more strictly enforced. Deviation from official procedures was less tolerated. The culture produced excellent results in some domains, but it was less effective at rapid innovation. The irony is that Germany had the resources and the technical capability to develop something like the Lee Light. German engineers were among the world's best. German military research programs were advanced. But the organizational structure was such that a Lee-like innovator would have faced even greater resistance. A German squadron leader would have been less likely to be able to build an illegal modification. Even if he had, a German commander-in-chief would have been less likely to authorize its rapid deployment. This organizational dimension of military competition is often overlooked in historical analysis. We focus on weapons and tactics and strategy. We count tanks and aircraft and ships. But the ability to innovate, to see problems clearly, to develop solutions, to implement them quickly, is often more important than any individual weapon system. The Lee Light won the Battle of the Atlantic because it was deployed quickly enough to affect the outcome. It was deployed quickly because Lee was willing to break rules and because Joubert was willing to back him. The organizational culture of Coastal Command was permissive enough to allow both of those things to happen. The final legacy of Humphrey Lee and the Lee Light is perhaps this: institutions that want to succeed need people like Lee. They need people who care more about solving problems than about following rules. They need leaders like Joubert who can recognize when rule-breaking is justified. And they need the organizational culture to support both of these things happening. But they also need to maintain enough discipline and structure that they don't descend into chaos. The balance is difficult to achieve. Most organizations err one way or the other. But the organizations that figure it out, that maintain discipline while leaving space for innovation, tend to be the ones that succeed. By that standard, the RAF of World War II was an organization that figured it out. The result was victory in the Battle of the Atlantic and countless other theaters of war. A man who broke regulations and a leader who backed him contributed to that victory in a way that statistically saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Humphrey Diver Lee died quietly, almost unknown outside military circles. The device he designed became so completely integrated into standard military practice that most people don't know it was once revolutionary. The rules he violated were eventually changed to accommodate the innovation. The organization that tried to stop him eventually embraced what he created. That's how innovation works in the best cases, so successfully integrated that it becomes invisible. We don't see the Searcher Light as an innovation anymore. We see it as a normal piece of equipment. We don't see Humphrey Lee as a rule breaker anymore. We see him as an officer who did his job well. But understanding what happened, Understanding the rule-breaking, the resistance, the risk, the eventual success, helps us understand how military organizations actually become effective. The Bay of Biscay was dark in 1941. Submarines operated with impunity. The Allies were losing the Battle of the Atlantic. The future looked dark. Then one officer, working in a workshop without authorization using salvaged parts, designed a light that could turn darkness into day for exactly 3 seconds. That light changed everything. It didn't end the war by itself. Nothing less than the combined military effort of the Allies could do that. But it was the moment when the tide turned in one critical theater. It was the moment when hope, which had been fading, was restored. It was the moment when an officer who violated regulations and a commander who backed him proved that sometimes the rules need to be broken in order to win. The men who carried out the actual attacks, who flew into darkness, who activated the light, who dropped the charges, who watched the submarines sink, those men were the ones who made it real. Lee gave them the tool. They did the work. The device worked because they flew it effectively and because they cared about doing the job well. But none of it would have happened if Lee hadn't been willing to violate regulations. None of it would have happened if Jalbert hadn't been willing to back him. None of it would have happened if the organization had been too rigid to allow innovation to occur outside official channels. That's the story the Lee Light tells if you're willing to listen. That institutions matter, that the people within them matter. And that sometimes the difference between losing and winning is whether the people in positions of authority have the wisdom to recognize when rules should be broken, and the courage to back the people doing the breaking. The searchlight still exists. The RAF museum has it. The device looks crude. It looks like something that shouldn't have worked. But it did work. It worked because someone understood a problem, cared enough to solve it, and was willing to accept the consequences of working outside the system to achieve the solution. That's rare, that's valuable. That's what every organization needs, but most organizations suppress. Organization needs, but most organizations suppress.